David, hi. Let's start at the basics, David. In your experience working with nonprofits in the US and elsewhere, what are in your opinion, the most common challenges they face these days?
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me. There are the perennial challenges of raising money, deploying the money, having sustainable sources of support as you do your work, growing the organization. But these days, the problems we see that are growing over what we might have seen 10 years ago have more to do with leadership, being able to attract and retain good leaders, structuring leadership. Sometimes people nowadays want to have co-leaders or team leadership or less hierarchy in general. And a lot of leaders are complaining about the difficulty of managing staff, that people are demanding of things that are not necessarily more pay, more benefits, but sort of more power sharing than our leaders are traditionally comfortable with or used to working within those kinds of structures. And these are progressive people who believe in transparency and equity and all the good things. But
Yeah.
it's a challenge for leadership. It's particularly a challenge when there's a merger and you bring together two different cultures of organizations that may have resolved or addressed these issues in different ways.
Interesting. So mergers are definitely on the rise here in Europe, in the UK, as well as in the US and globally. Transatlantic mergers we've seen more and more of. And my colleagues at Amsterdam forecast a 20 to 30% increase in mergers this year, 2023, because of some of the challenges that you have just said, these funding challenges, the synergies that can be generated. But then in my limited experience and my experience with mergers, the pitfalls always come just after the merger. But you are focusing on that, David. I'd love to hear from your experience. It's been about decades of experience you have with M&A, mergers and acquisitions in the charitable sector. What are the common pitfalls, and how would you sort of navigate them and avoid them?
So, Chris, you put your finger on it that people focus on the difficulty of the negotiations, but the real difficulty begins when the negotiations are successful.
Right.
And now we have to work together. We have great models for bringing people to a decision, whether to merge or not, in the quickest time frame, least painful way. But then, quite often, what happens is the boards step back and say, "Well, we stepped forward to help with the negotiations. Now we're done." Staff return to focusing on the work, and all of the integration challenges are delegated to someone who may not have enough authority to actually pull them off. So the classic challenges that we see are autonomy concerns, both the prior organizations' identities and their autonomy, individual autonomy of what is my role and how much freedom do I have to operate within a culture that's different now than what we were before. The role of are we building a new culture, or is it really an acquisition? In the for-profit world, in M&A, an acquisition is someone is buying your company, and so it's very clear that they are the new owners, and we're going to do things their way. But in the nonprofit world, where no money changes hands, and we simply decide that we're going to pursue our missions in a organized, unified way, it's much less clear. And sometimes a smaller organization's culture is stronger, and the larger organization wants to import some elements of that. We
Mhm.
usually tell people you have to think about this as creating a new organization, that you are merging organizational cultures, and you want to kind of affirmatively, consciously create a new culture that's shared among the organizations. And that's one of the major challenges. System problems, where people have different systems, those can be worked out, and technical people or consultants can be brought in to work that out. The people problems, the challenges there are really that the leaders need to figure out a way to bring people together.
And can you give me some good and bad examples of this one? Because my experience has entirely agrees here with yours that after a merger, once the conversation is done, once the contract has been done, the press release has been written, you have this sort of exhaustion and celebration and this fake feel that we are done.
Hmm.
It's been done. I agree with you. Most mergers and corporations, the real work begins after the press release, after the publication of us working together.
Mhm.
So, what would be your top tips, or maybe an example where it's been done really badly and really, really well, so we can learn from that?
Well, there's one that always stands out for me, painfully, as done really badly. This from many years ago, and the names will not be used to protect the guilty here, but it
Of
was a
course.
merger between two museums. Who the two museums were very competitive with each other, but they shared common donors, and and they both wanted to build new buildings. And the donors said, "We want you to work together and merge before we'll give any money. We don't want to be asked for money from both parties. We want to have a unified group." So I was brought in and tried to facilitate negotiations in a way that raised all the issues, the differences, the cultural differences between them. Uh, and they were all there, but they decided they had to merge anyway, even though I thought, and I said to them, I didn't think this was a good idea, because that was the way they would get the money to build their buildings.
Right.
And when they pulled off the merger, it was a disaster. There was a public breakup a year, maybe a year and a half later. Their deep pocketed board members who were going to be giving money for the buildings pulled out, and the organizations split off and went back to, it was like a divorce. They got married and they quickly got divorced. So that was a very painful process that we could have seen coming, and I did see coming, because I thought it would be a miracle if they overcame the differences that they faced. Um, on the more positive side, uh, we did a merger that involved a European group and an American group a couple of years ago, and they appointed a team of two women who were one from each of the predecessor organizations to be the integration managers, who were given enough authority to really tell senior management what needed to happen. And they worked very well together. And because they were from different organizations, they had to form a new relationship. And they were able to oversee these workflows that were really very, very helpful. Similarly, in an American merger that we worked on with two major infrastructure organizations, they created a series of work groups on technical issues, on culture issues, et cetera. And over a period of a year, saw those groups really lead the charge on the merger. I'm actually re-engaged with that group now, and it's been 3 years since the merger, and they are really merged. Sometimes we have these kind of faux mergers where people are still living in their prior lives, and there's very little connection and overlap. And in this case, it really is. If you walked in as a new employee today and no one told you that the two groups had merged, you probably wouldn't even know it, because they're so fully integrated.
And that sounds absolutely interesting. On the workflows and on the work groups you just referred to, David, mind just telling me a little bit more about this? Because it sounds to me, from what you've just said, that these two professionals came together and they created the workflows, and you said that really helped. I presume these are process workflows that are now new in the joint organization, and then the work groups, I presume, do something similar. How long did they need for that? What did that take? How long did you have to be involved? And were there any sort of pitfalls there, workflows that needed to be, amended and amended and amended again?
Mhm. It is a process of coming together and of understanding what the challenges are, and what the best way forward is. The With the American European merger, um, I think those folks had a mandate for about a year.
Okay.
I was not very involved in that process, actually. After we facilitated the merger negotiation, I came to Europe for an integration meeting with the boards, which was very successful. The boards really bonded and felt like they were on the same page. We did some fun exercises, had some celebratory meals, that sort of thing. And then I was just sort of on call for when somebody had a question or a problem. And these two people who were managing the transition, they would call me periodically with, we're having trouble with senior management figuring out how to move this forward, and I would give them advice. But they were very competent and very very able to do that. And that was in an environment where there were enough resources to pull a couple of fairly senior people offline from their jobs and give them this integration job for a year.
Great.
And that was essential. In most cases, that is not the case. The CEO of the merged entity is trying to make the integration work while fundraising, managing the programs, managing finances, doing all the things they normally do. And that's where a lot of consulting help is useful, because if you don't have internal leaders who can be put full time on a project like that, having outsiders is very helpful. One other thing I'll add is, so I've written books about both. So I've written these two books, the Nonprofit Mergers Workbook. Part one is about negotiations, and part two is about post-merger integration. And what was really interesting is, in the literature review before writing these books, when I looked at the corporate literature, because there was none for nonprofits, on how to negotiate a merger, it was completely useless, because it is so completely different with the acquisition model that you have. But then when we got to part two of the book, that was about post-merger integration, the business literature was completely on point, because despite the significant differences in the economic model, it's people. It's really bringing people together, and the issues were all the same. So it was very useful. So that was a very interesting, different literature review experiences.
Fantastic. So yeah, the mergers and acquisitions in the NGO world are really different from the literature that exists for the corporate world. Absolutely agreed. Let's step back. Two more questions that I have, David, that I really want to get your input on. Um, let's step back to the right beginning when people are considering a merger. Let's imagine you're the leader of a nonprofit, doesn't really matter where, and you are eyeing up a potential partner. You're having these preliminary meetings on the side of official meetings, or over a drink or two, or in any conferences. And when the thing comes up, and you and I may have been part of this, where we think, oh, we should really merge, or we should really work closer together. Um, when is the point when you would advise a leader to seriously consider a merger, and when is the point where you say, no, that's just a joint venture?
Yeah. So the first thing to keep in mind, and we have some graphics that help with this, is that merger is sort of one end of a continuum of partnerships. There are a whole range. When you mentioned joint venture, there are a whole range of different ways organizations work together all the time. I mean, there are collaborative efforts to raise money, or to lobby a government entity to give more resources to a field. And so and then there are joint ventures, which are very limited in what they're doing. Sometimes
Yeah,
it's just sharing back office work. So what I advise our clients is, a merger is really a very big step, possibly the most important and most risky thing that you might undertake in your tenure, with potentially the highest payoff. But
right.
you should only undertake a merger if that's what's required. If what you're looking for is really the synergy of integration of strategy and mission, then a merger is maybe the solution. Whereas if you're just looking to save money on the back end, or some sort of efficiency, or if a group has a particular skill that you would like to acquire, there are less integrative partnerships that you could form to acquire those assets without having to go through the whole thing of a merger.
What about funding, David? I mean, after Brexit, a lot of UK organizations face huge difficulties accessing EU funds. America, the institutional donors in the US are sort of reinforcing that Buy American paradigm, making it less untied, making it difficult for non-US organizations becoming USAID donees and recipients. Um, is it a good idea to just acquire or to merge with a organization with eligibility in their big home donor markets? Is that a good rationale, or would you say there's other ways too?
I would say that's a reason to think about it. That certainly could be a motivation, but it feels a little bit too mechanical to be the reason to really merge your full entities. There might be a partnership that you'd form with them to be able to access a different market, but um, I don't think so. Excuse me. I also think that in the in the consideration of merger, since you're bringing together your cultures, your staffing, your assets, buildings, investments, all of that become integrated. You need to really think about the opportunity cost of pulling all that together, and the amount of time and trouble it's going to take, versus some other way you could have spent that time and energy. So if your goal is, for example, as an EU group, to access American funding,
Yeah.
there are some foundations that will, of course, fund outside our borders, and that are focused on that. But if you feel you need to access those resources, I would start by saying, is there some sort of partnership that we could create with an American NGO that has the same mission that we have? And then what might happen is, over time, the relationship builds to a point where there is a desire to merge.
Yeah.
It's a little bit. We often use relationship metaphors, and it's a little bit like dating before you move in together, before you get married. You don't just meet somebody and say, let's get married. You've got to figure out how that relationship is going to work, and whether long term it's what you want.
Yep. It's not Las Vegas style dating.
Not Las Vegas style. That's right.
That's
That's right. And also, I think it's easier to get divorced than it is to undo a merger. So,
Oh dear. David, so final question. In my change management experience, in restructuring large IGOs and NGOs, it's the system integration is always symbolic of the people culture, and if the systems don't work, it's usually also because they've evolved in a dysfunctional manner because the culture doesn't work, and vice versa, by the way. So it's sort of mutually reinforcing. But coming down to that first point you made about leadership, and with that being said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of essential leadership skills and sort of personal behaviors that nonprofit leaders who are maybe struggling to develop or implement a successful scaling strategy need to have. And what I mean with scaling strategy is it's an underlying assumption that you may not share. If you don't, please comment. I believe that in order to build a better world, we want NGOs to scale. I think tinkering around the edges doesn't help. We actually need to solve societal, ecological, planetary problems, not just admire their problems better. And for that, the sector as a whole needs to scale. Mergers and acquisitions, and joint ventures, and the whole breadth of marrying up is a part of it. But it all comes down to leadership. So, what in your side, on your side of the pond, maybe you have an example. What are sort of the leadership skills and the personal behaviors that are really make a difference to the scaling and growth ambition of an organization, and maybe what is really hindering it?
So let me start by agreeing with you about scaling. I wrote an entire book, Play to Win, the Nonprofit Guide to Competitive Strategy, in which I argue that if you have an effective program, you have a moral and ethical responsibility to grow it and to gain resources, even at the expense of less effective organizations,
Right.
because it's not about us all having a place at the table. It's about us changing the world. So I agree with you 100%.
Right.
Uh,
I'm so glad you say this, because the lack of ambition is really hurting those who are in need, right?
Right, right. That's right. We're not in business to provide jobs for people who care about issues. We're in business to change the world. And that's why we're all here. So your question about leadership. Uh, I've worked with, as you have, I'm sure, hundreds of leaders of different styles. Um, and there are many different leadership styles that can work, or personalities that people bring that can work. But there are a few things that I always look for when I am asking myself, is this person going to be the right leader for this organization? So first is, the person has to have genuine personal integrity. They have to not be interested in sort of feathering their own nest, promoting their own ego as the primary driver. And some people do get into these roles from a kind of narcissistic. It's true in government. It's true in corporate world. It's not anything unique about the nonprofit world. But you can tell pretty quickly whether someone is there to promote their own brand, or to get the work done.
Yes.
And then secondarily, how do those leaders view the people who work with them? Is their job to enable those people to succeed and to strengthen them and to provide them with the resources and push them from behind? Or are these people more like servants who are there to carry out your bidding? I'll give you a great example of I worked with a very large NGO, global NGO. The CEO called me in to work with the 10-member senior management team because he felt that they were not stepping up to the plate, and he was guiding too much of the work, and they weren't carrying the weight. So I interviewed each of them. I sat in on a management team meeting, and I got what the issue was. And so afterwards, I said to him, you are like the, and I tried to be very complimentary to people so they'll listen to me. So I said, you're like the smartest guy in the room. You always raise the issues and you answer them before anybody else has a chance to even weigh in. They're still thinking about it. So if you want them to stand up, you need to step back. Uh, and he looked at me and he said, I didn't hire you to advise me how to change. I hired you to help them change. We're done. And I was fired on the spot from that engagement. So that's the kind of leader that I think of as they can be successful, but does anybody really want to work for them? Uh,
I mean, there's a saying here in Germany, the saying as advisors to our clients, and our partner NGOs. Our partner NGOs are always at the center of everything we do, and
mhm.
therefore always in the way.
Yes. Well, yeah, we have a similar saying. We say it would be a really great business if we just didn't have all these clients, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we have a fair amount of war stories of interesting and personalities around. But I take from your answer the what I also think the humble approach, the servant approach, the
Mhm.
coaching CEO, as opposed to the directive general who's admired and adhered to.
But yes, I agree. But then there's the other side to that. There are people who are so nice and care so much about what their people think that they can't make hard decisions and they
Right.
can't push. So there's a balance there between really caring about people, but never forgetting that the people are there for the purpose not of um, making sure they have nice, happy jobs, but so that the work they do improves the problem that the organization was founded and is funded to work on. And this is uh, it's a delicate balance to find people who can handle the amount of stress that goes on, also at a senior level, around everything that you do. And any mistake you make can have huge repercussions for your team, for your organization. If you fail to raise enough money, people lose their jobs, people lose services, battles aren't fought. But it's really that servant leadership approach that you're referencing, but also with enough sort of seriousness of purpose and ability to go against the flow when necessary to make hard decisions. And what that requires is having some sort of vision of where you're trying to go, so that you can inspire other people to move toward that vision.
David, I know I promised this to be the last sort of thought, but I have to ask the following. I'm sorry, you're not quite released you're not quite off duty just yet. You may have had the same situation. I have seen merger, change, restructuring projects where organizations committed themselves, usually with new incoming leadership, to a great new direction or a more pervasive, more thorough follow through on to really make identify the levers which address the problem that they are founded and funded to do. And then when the going gets tough, the leader doesn't have the follow through.
Mm-hmm.
They face some trustees are resistant. Maybe some employees quit because they're not carrying the new direction or they don't get it, or at the very principal level, a new business development initiative when the going is bound to get tough, and then the leader fails to communicate and sort of chips away at the ambition until nothing is left.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that can happen in a merger in any structure as well. Have you had that experience? And what would you say to these leaders?
It happens frequently, and also I would say new leaders sometimes are wrong. Right, that we're all human, and so you come in with your grand new scheme, and you think this is the way to go, and it turns out that's not the way to go. So you have to have some humility even there about your vision, so that you hear the naysayers, because I've been in the position myself, certainly, where I'm all excited about something, and somebody on my team, to my horror, raises a point that I actually agree with, and I realize my idea wasn't as good as I thought. So you have to go back to the drawing board. But there is I'm going to answer this in sort of a different way, because what we're talking about here is this sort of traditional notion of the leader coming in with an idea, driving the organization forward. And what we're seeing more and more now, in at least on our side of the pond, is an interest in decentering that person and having a much wider base of power in the organization, where there are more people with management or management-like roles, and even people who are frontline contributors have a say in where we go. And the question then is, if that's what's being demanded, and I think that is what's being demanded by workers, by funders in our environment, then it makes the leadership even more complex, because you can't just go off for a long hike and come back with a brilliant idea and tell people let's implement it. You have to figure out what that idea is and have it sort of emerge from the conversation with all of your colleagues. I
Gotcha.
think if you pull that off, you're going to have more chance of success, because you won't have the pushback. You'll have everyone understanding why we're moving in a direction. And again, the balance here is the leader needs to know when the group's intelligence is right and we move in that direction, and when you feel you have a better idea than the team does and you need to push. And that is always a balance of uh, and that's why having some humility counts. It's like the best idea should win, and you shouldn't think your idea is always the best, but you shouldn't
That's
also defer to the group either, because they may be wrong.
yeah. I mean, on that one, just one final thought, maybe because it fits into what you've just been saying, David. Was involved in a large-scale change management of a European and Swiss-based organization where they changed their methodology, and it was a global organization represented in many countries, and they have committed themselves to a data and evidence-led decision process, and in doing this, and it turns out for most program officers and for most countries, their project and program methodology had to change, and it was fine, and it was along the sort of the core leaders' thoughts, which they were appointed to turn this organization around. And then there was this call where a analyst or a very junior person in the mid-20s from Nigeria said, in this group call, big launch of a new way, she leaned in and said, "That's not right. This is the data. Sorry." And I loved that, because this junior had the you know data and the authority to speak out,
That's
and
right.
she was right. In her country, that didn't apply.
Hmm.
Um, that leader, fortunately, turned around in that call and said, "You're right. We'll find another way for your country."
That is exactly my example. You have a strong vision of where you need to go. You develop strategies, but you're not all knowing, and other people will have ideas. And there could be cultures, I can imagine, where that young person did not feel empowered to speak up, even though
Yes,
they had the data. And so they sit there simmering and saying, "This isn't going to work. This isn't going to work." But they never raise it, because somebody else probably raised something at an earlier meeting and got shot down. And it doesn't mean the CEO has to agree with you, but you have to welcome that pushback and that questioning, because if your ideas can't stand up with your own team, then they're probably not good enough for the real world.
that's a great final word. David, any final words? How many more mergers and joint ventures are we going to see this year, 2023? Any guess?
For me, people always ask me this. If it's good economic times, they'll say, "Well, are there more mergers?" If it's bad economic times, they'll say, "Are there more mergers?" And my answer is always the same: I don't really know, because we are the leading source of guiding merger discussions in the U.S. We do so many of them that I don't see trends like that. What I see is just a lot of mergers all the time.
Right.
And so I guess I'm not the best person to know about that. And in the U.S. at least, statistics, we've tried in the past to get statistics from state governments, and we have 50 different state governments that keep the statistics differently, because the nonprofits are incorporated in a state. It's very difficult to determine how many mergers are actually even happening, because dissolutions, sometimes mergers are executed as a dissolution, and that's the way it gets recorded. So I have no idea, but I know there's plenty of mergers being undertaken. And I'll just take you back to in 1980s, the late 1980s, when I was a nonprofit executive and I had my first merger. There was nothing to read. There was no one to talk to. I had to sort of figure it out on my own.
Mhm.
And we went through 3 mergers while I was in that job. And by the end of that, I was seen as an expert because no one else had written anything about it or really thought about it. It was a whole new thing. And now you fast forward all those years, those decades, and it's a very common tool in everyone's toolbox. And that's very gratifying to me to see that not that everyone needs to go through a merger, but that it is on the radar of something that might be the solution to your strategic position.
Fantastic. And we'll definitely make sure that my colleagues and we will link these very useful resources in the bottom of the text of this podcast. We will also we will definitely link your resources in the bottom of this podcast for people to read your documents. And if you do need and want to get in touch with David on mergers or with us at MZN, then by all means drop us a line through the contact box at the bottom. David, thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciated it.
What a
And
pleasure, Chris. Enjoyed it very much.
very good. And we'll have you back on at the end of the year to see what happened in mergers in 2023.
Great.
Perfect. Okay, then let me just press the stop button. I hope that doesn't shut down the conversation, David.
We'll see.
I'll press this pause button.